Hello, everyone. Today we're doing our next lecture in the series Free Universities for Free Scientific Education. Today we have Professor Paul Cockshott as our guest. For those of you who don't know who Professor Cockshott is, he's a Marxist professor active in economics and computer science at the University of Glasgow. He's the author of books such as Towards a New Socialism, How the World Works, and Computation and Its Limits. Professor, welcome. Welcome to our program.
Just a correction. I'm now retired, so I'm no longer working at the University of Glasgow.
Okay, we'll make sure to add
Yes.
that. All right, we want to begin with the next question. What is the current economic situation and the current as well as the coming crises, economic crisis? And from this standpoint, where does socialism come into the picture? Where does socialism come into the play? Specifically, how do you see the transition from today's capitalism to socialism, Professor?
Well, when you talk about crises, there are crises at different timescales. There's a very immediate crisis caused by the pandemic. And that's a short timescale crisis which is hit suddenly, and its duration will be comparatively short, but is extremely severe. In terms of the depression it's producing in output, it's the most severe that has hit capitalism for over 100 years. But because it is caused by a disease rather than a specifically economic mechanism within capitalism, it in principle could be overcome relatively quickly. And you can see that in a country like China or Vietnam, where you still have a substantial state role in the economy, it's possible to overcome the adverse effects of the disease quite quickly. Whether that'll happen quickly in capitalist countries is another matter. I think it'll take considerably longer. But also, when I said it's not immediately an economic cause, that's only in a narrow sense of talking about economics. In a deeper sense of talking about economics, it does have an economic cause. All pandemics arise from changes in the way society produces what it needs and the way it interacts. And the rapid spread of this virus is due to capitalist globalization. Without the rapid air transport produced in the last 30 years, it wouldn't have spread like this. So it does have an economic cause as well. But then if you start looking at the time scale of crises, this is a very immediate and intense short crisis. And if the history of epidemics is anything to go by, pandemics can produce radical social change. They can produce crises, political crises. And we can see that this is being produced already in the United States, which is the country worst hit by the pandemic. But there's a time scale beyond that. And the time scale, there are two time scales beyond that producing crises. The first of them is a crisis due to the rising capital to labor ratio. Now that it started to affect Western capitalism from the 1970s really, and brought to an end the period of rapid growth that had been experienced after the Second World War. Now, because it leads to a falling rate of profit. Now, this affects all capitalist economies and is basically driven by the difference between the rate of growth of the working class and the rate of growth of the capital stock at a world scale. And a rapid rate of growth of capital stock at a world scale can only be sustained if the working class population grows at the same or a faster rate. Now, that was achieved during the period from 1980 to roughly the present, by the rapid incorporation of new workforces in countries like China, India, Indonesia, and Turkey, for that matter, where it was possible for extensive capital accumulation to take place. Certainly in China, that's no longer possible.
Right.
The rate of growth of the workforce in China has slowed down. It's still possible in India. To a limited extent, is it possible in Turkey? The organic composition of capital in Turkey is rising. Now, when these things happen, this creates a crisis for bourgeois civilization, since it depends on exponential growth of capital stock. And that exponential growth of capital stock can only really be sustained by an exponential growth of the proletariat. And when that comes to an end, profitability and the exponential growth of capital is no longer possible. And this produces a whole series of crises. Firstly, it tends to produce underinvestment because of the lower rate of profit, slows down capital investment. That was the main way Western Europe responded. You got a reduced rate of capital accumulation post-1980. And the rate of profit recovered due to that, or stopped falling due to that, or slowed down its fall due to that. But at a world scale, that's not happening. The second effect is that the reduction in the growth of the world proletariat means that the competitive position of the working class against capital gradually strengthens. This is most evident in China, where there is now a rapid increase in real wages. And it's easy for Chinese workers to win strikes. This is similar to the situation which existed in Western Europe in the period leading up to the capitalist crisis of the 1970s. Rapid accumulation of capital had increased the bargaining position of the working class and undermined the social position of the bourgeoisie. And this was very evident across Western Europe at that time and produced a crisis for the bourgeoisie. Now, they got out of that by being able to export capital to the East. But now that situation is different because the Chinese government is having to shift from a pro-capitalist, unequivocally pro-capitalist line, which was followed, say, 30 years ago, to a more social democratic position that's being followed now. And you've got a strengthening of the working class in China. And this produces politically an impact on the world scale, in that you're again seeing the revival of a Cold War, which the bourgeoisie thought they had got rid of forever, but it's now come back. But these are, I've dealt with two timescales: the timescale of the pandemic and the timescale of the overaccumulation of capital. Now, that the process of overaccumulation of capital has not completed yet, because there still are substantial reserves of labor power in Africa and India that could be exploited by capital. But let's leave that scale out. The next scale is the time scale imposed by the climate crisis that is being induced by capitalism. We are going to see the end, one way or another, of fossil fuel capitalism, both either because of the exhaustion of oil reserves or because we've passed peak oil production already, or due to the requirement by international agreement to reduce fossil fuel production. Now, my opinion is that's going to be too late. It'll be too late to prevent serious climate disruption. The most immediate effects of that are going to be the impact on world food prices. there is going to be declines in yields of the main food crops in areas which the world is heavily dependent on because of rising temperatures and changes in rainfall patterns. And this is going to become a major crisis over the next 10 to 20 years, I think. Then even longer scale, what's happening in some ways must be seen as the second deglaciation. There was a deglaciation event 10,000 years ago. The melting of the northern ice caps. And that produced in human society a shift from the Mesolithic to the Neolithic. It produced a shift from hunting and gathering society to societies that were forced to survive by growing crops. And this occurred in multiple regions of the world at the same time. Unconnected areas of the world were forced to shift from hunting and gathering to raising crops. And from that, after a prolonged period, you got the rise of class society. Now we're seeing a climate change on the horizon within the next 100 years at least that is of comparable scale, and which can only be overcome by deliberate planning and regulation of the environment on a world scale.
Yeah.
It provides the external impetus that necessitates a change in the mode of production into one of the planned use of the world's resources. So that means that, a crisis of a scale we haven't seen for thousands of years. Now, as to the question of how socialism will come about, it's impossible to make a political prediction like that. The situation is too complex. I mean, I suspect that the model of the existing bourgeois state is going to be heavily attacked with a pressure towards direct democracy. You can see this in the demands that were put forward by the Yellow Vests in France, which is an entirely spontaneous movement, arising out as a result, in part, of the measures that the government was taking due to climate change. And what they were demanding is basically a return to classical democracy. And I think if you look at what's happening in America at the moment, it's very disorganized, but it's a vast popular response against the state. And I think it'll evolve towards a movement for popular democracy. I don't know what will happen in the rest of the world, and you can't rule out the possibility that, as with the 20th century, big social changes may come through world war.
Yeah. In your book, Towards a New Socialism, you've talked about central planning, use of labor tokens, getting rid of money as we know it, central egalitarian pay, and market strategies such as market clearance pricing. So can you open those concepts a little bit and explain to us how will socialism meet the demands of people?
Okay. Well, you've got to bear in mind that there's two types of demands that a socialist economy has to meet. One is for directly social consumption. Things like education, health provision, some cultural provision of free cultural activities, free broadcasting, free availability of library materials. Right. That kind of thing is directly social. There's other consumption needs which vary from individual person and individual family from one to another. And this is the point where Marx is saying that different people have different needs. Okay, now question: how can you meet that in a system which is not based on exploitation? And the basic Marxian principle is that exploitation occurs when one person's labor is used to support other people without any recompense.
Mm-hmm.
And the first level response to that Marx gives is that people should be paid in terms of the labor they do. That since human time is the basis of all value, you should shift from monetary calculation to direct calculation in time. Things are only valuable because it takes human time to make them. And this is fetishized or mystified in terms of money prices. And people think that wealth is money. Whereas really, the cost of things is not money. The cost of things is people making them.
Yep.
Or the time they expend to make them. So the principle he set forward was that people should be paid with labor accounts. Now, these are not, he called them labor certificates.
Mm-hmm.
And these were not going to be like banknotes, which would pass around and circulate. Okay?
Right.
The certificate was going to have your name on it. That you personally did 36 hours for society last week. Mm-hmm. And you personally are liable to pay a deduction for commonly consumed goods and for the support of those unable to work. But once that's taken off, suppose that's 12 hours of your work was to support community, then 24 hours of your work for the last week is what you're entitled to get back from society. And you're entitled to get that back in the form of the goods you want. As he says, withdrawn from the communal stores.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the communal stores with modern technology would be supermarkets. But, and he talks about certificates. Now, when he talked about the certificates, he didn't say what the certificate's going to be. But another socialist writer, I don't know, have you ever read Bellamy?
No.
The American socialist of the 1880s. He envisaged a society, he wrote a science fiction novel in which a man goes to sleep for 100 years and wakes up in a future socialist Boston in the year 2000. It's a good novel. And it's very interesting to see the sort of view of the future that someone in the 1880s had. But the striking thing about it is he invented the idea of the credit card. He invented it in a socialist context, that people would each week be given a card, or each month get a card with markings on it for the number of hours they did. Mm-hmm. And when you went to a shop, these would be punched out. Okay, the punch cards, punch holes in them. Okay, just to cancel them out. So there's no circulation there, just a hole is made. Mm-hmm. And he sort of envisaged the Amazon type of delivery system because he said everyone would have pneumatic tubes going to their houses, which would deliver the goods to them. But the point is that, okay, that was 19th century technology, using paper cards, which would be punched. Nowadays, you'd use SIM cards. Mm-hmm. You use SIM cards, which your number of hours would be recorded, and you could take out goods equivalent to that after you had paid the community charge for the social goods, which are provided to everyone.
Right.
But this issue of market clearing prices, this is not a central issue for us, but it's a possible thing you might have to do. If a society gets the plan slightly wrong, mm-hmm. and produces too much of something, okay, instead of making those available to people at the actual amount of labor that went into them, they, in order to prevent waste, they should be made available to people for less labor. Now, some social labor has obviously been wasted in making those products.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, the state wholesaling sector would have to raise the price of some other goods to compensate for that wasted labor in let's say too many summer shirts had been made. You make those available to people for, each summer shirt is available for 1 hour 10 minutes instead of 1.5 hours, which it actually really took to make. Okay. But in compensation, maybe sugar or products containing sugar are charged with more labor than actually was expended to make the sugar.
Mm-hmm.
But the essential thing is that the budgetary rule the socialist economy has to follow is that the amount of labor charge, or the nominal charge for the goods distributed to the society, has to equal the number of hours that actually went into making the whole lot taken across the things which are overproduced or underproduced.
Yep.
Otherwise, you're no longer carrying out a rational system of accounting.
Yes.
So that's what the market clearing aspect of it is about. It's ensuring that the hours worked actually are accurately reflected in the hours charged. What was your next part of the question? I've forgotten.
Well,
yes, for social goods,
mm-hmm.
we envisage that the collective that is, for instance, running the hospitals in a city is given a budget in terms of the number of person hours per year that they're allowed to use for health treatment, and that includes the person hours of the doctors and nurses who are working there directly, and the person hours that go into building and repairing the hospitals, the person hours that go into the medicines, etc. So that the same system would be used for social budgeting as is used for personal goods.
Mm-hmm.
We're saying this against a certain trend in the left who thinks you can completely do away with any kind of economic calculation, who think that this is all the value, what they call the value form, and you shouldn't concern yourself with the value form, and everything should be available to everyone for free. But that's not, you can't do any social budgeting on that basis. You have to say, what is going to be the limit to the expenditure that the health department can use? What is going to be the limit to the expenditure in terms of human effort that the education system can use? Unless you set a limit in terms of human effort, you can't rationally organize it at all.
Right.
The next issue, I suppose, is whether or not you can rationally plan these things. At the time,
central planning, hence.
Yeah, at the time we were writing in the late 80s, at the crisis of the Soviet Union, this was obviously more controversial than it is now, because people can now see how advanced the internet is and computer technology is, and that it's quite possible for supercomputers to carry out rational planning at whole society-wide level. The level of computer power that Google puts into making available search engines could easily be applied. That if a fraction of Google's search engine capacity was devoted to physical planning, it could easily do that. The computer technology has advanced so much since the 1980s that many of the sort of things we had to propose in a book there, the sort of communications technologies we proposed, etc., are now well outdated because we wrote them in terms of what was available in the late 1980s. Nowadays, the technologies have advanced a lot. During the 80s, I was trying to design computers to do this. I was designing computers with 128-bit address spaces because I reckoned that in order to carry out a worldwide socialist plan, you needed of the order of 2 to the 48 computer terminals around the world, which would need to be able to handle up to 2 to the 48 objects, and you needed a certain amount of other bits to handle security codes and things like that. Now, basically, what we were investigating in our research group was a worldwide network of computer memory, but that worldwide network of computer memory now exists in the form of the internet with URLs. The URL system is not as fast and efficient as the sort of system you'd arrive at as a hardware engineer, which was where I was coming to it from. But it's functional. It'll do. We have the capacity to work with that.
Absolutely. Okay. So, Jen, okay, how do you think technology under capitalism is organized? And how would it be organized, helping us tackle issues of central planning and participatory democracy? Specifically, I want to mention historical projects. So historically, in socialist countries, there have been several use of technologies in central planning and the government itself. The Soviet Union started working in Agas for computerized central planning in 1962. The main architect of which was Viktor Glushkov. In Chile, in the 70s, Stafford Beer and his team installed a cybernetic system for the government in just 4 months. And currently, there are even discussions about using blockchain for communication between socialized units of production and for referendums and such for participatory democracy.
It's a great pity that Glushkov's plans were not properly funded. As I understand it, they thought it was going to be too expensive to develop, but it was too expensive not to develop them. Now, on the issue, I've touched a bit on this in what I said previously. I think enough of the technologies have arisen already, initially for capitalist defense purposes in the internet, which was originally a military technology of the United States, but they're now developing at a rate which is easily going to be enough to handle what we need. On the question of blockchain, I'm extremely suspicious of that as having any relevance to socialist activities. The blockchain system was invented essentially by libertarians as a means of creating a modern digital version of the gold standard, in which things acquire value by having actual labor wasted to produce them. So you have a huge amount of energy and therefore indirectly labor being wasted on blockchain calculations in the Bitcoin mining business. Now, this is a total social waste.
Yeah.
And in terms of the energy cost to carry out a transaction, it's extremely inefficient. And the reason it's extremely inefficient is it's based on total atomization and maximum distrust between agents. Nobody's trusting anyone else unless you can prove you've done the calculation to validate it. And that's not necessary for any efficient, socially regulated system. I mean, compared to the energy cost of Bitcoin, just the bank clearance system is immensely more efficient. And it's the libertarians' distrust of any centralization that makes them go for blockchain systems. And I don't think that's necessary at all. I think you can have direct democracy with much, much lower technology than that. You don't need anything significantly more developed than the most basic Nokia handset to carry it out. I mean, the candy vote system we worked out was designed so that it could be applied even in the poorest countries where people had the most basic mobile phone technology. So it wouldn't use advanced technology. And the other reason I'm distrustful of things that involve elaborate cryptography is that it requires incredibly specialized knowledge to know whether that kind of cryptography is secure or not. Okay? I have worked for many years in the computer industry and in teaching computing, and it is only with the greatest difficulty that I can read the papers proposing these cryptographic-based direct democracy systems and have any confidence that they are secure or not. I think it's they rely on over excessive levels of complexity. I mean, the level of complexity I was advocating was very simple, that you have people pick up a card, a voting card, by putting their hand in a physical jar, pulling out a sealed envelope with your card on it, which has got your voter's number, and you can use that for the year on any referendum. And it's just the fact that only you know that number is what provides the security. Right. In the same way that only you knowing your credit card number provides an adequate level of security. You don't need anything more sophisticated than a piece of plastic with a number printed on it. And you send that number when you vote in a text message. And at the end of the vote, the way everyone's number, the thing lists who voted yes, who voted no by their number, and everyone can go and look and see that their vote was on the right side of the tally, that their number occurred on the left or the right-hand side, because you make the file downloadable so anyone who wishes to search the file can download it and search it, and anyone can run a word count program to count the number of how many numbers in the yes column there were and how many numbers in the no column there were. The whole thing is open and above board and just relies on the kind of simple secrecy technology that any person can understand. And the randomization should be physical randomization. Just shuffle up the envelopes with the cards and you put your hand in. I don't think it's sensible to put huge levels of obscurity in the form of the Bitcoin system on top, or block code system on top of it. You need something that every voter can understand, that it's simple and straightforward.
Right. Professor, can you talk about about what Stafford Beer had done in Chile in terms of cybernetics and its relevance? I'm sorry.
It's not central planning. You have to realize that cybernetics had, if you think of its usage in the 60s, had two different meanings. In some uses in the 60s, cybernetics was taken to mean computing in general, okay? And particularly in the Eastern Bloc, it tended to be computing and cybernetics were seen as the same thing. But the school of cybernetics that Beer comes from is that which originates with Norbert Wiener, which came from a very specific type of computing, which is the type of computing required for military command and control. So it was related to, well, Wiener was working on anti-aircraft direction systems, okay? And the presentation of this information in the control center of a warship. How is this information presented in a warship in such a way as to give the captain situational awareness of the planes that are attacking them? Now, it's that type of command and control cybernetics that Beer was working for, which is why his emphasis is on the control rooms with the big screens and the commanders sitting in a semicircle deciding what to do next. It's the based on the system, you know, in the 1950s, the NORAD air defense system. These are the things in his mind. So it was to respond to crises, and the computer technologies he was using were ones that were trying to filter out normal events so that they never get reported. And all that gets reported to the control center, where Allende and his ministers are going to be, are abnormalities which require intervention. So that kind of thing is a good idea, but it's not the same thing as comprehensive detailed planning that Glushkov was talking about. Because Glushkov was assuming that he wanted something equivalent to the internet, connecting every factory and tracking all the goods that were moving. Beer was concentrating on the command and control system. He was adapting military command and control systems to political use.
Right. Okay. So in the context of the mechanisms and technologies and principles of socialism that you've talked about, so Professor, what was the socialist experience in socialist countries up to now? For example, the Soviet experience, where money still persisted and the use of labor tokens was not implemented, or the state of central planning in Soviet Union, for example. Just examples.
Well, these are big topics. Just a few things about them. The money wasn't complete money, because if in a market economy, if you have access to money, that's all you need to get resources. What you had in Russia was a combination of the circulation of rubles and ruble accounts for enterprises with directive planning as well. And having money is not enough to get goods. The goods had to be allocated to you by the plan. On the other hand, the distribution to individual humans was via wages, and products were sold for money, rubles. Okay, the fact that they were circulating paper rubles and coins, the fact that they were circulating meant you could get black markets. People could accumulate them. It also meant that because a lot of services were provided free and were paid for out of indirect taxation, you got a big discrepancy between the amount of labor that was represented by the ruble wage that a person was paid and the amount of labor they actually performed. So in a Soviet type economy, the money wage is below the necessary labor time because a substantial number of free services were provided. Now, this has a bad effect on economic calculation. It means that it doesn't cost a factory much to keep a reserve of labor, to hoard labor. And this tends to result in inefficient use of labor. And it also means that labor appears cheaper than machinery. So to the extent that a factory is, to the extent that they started to introduce cost accounting based on money to the factories, if they attempted to minimize their money costs, would reduce their labor, wouldn't reduce their labor as much as they would reduce their machinery. Okay, because machinery is paid for at full value, whereas labor is paid for at a fraction of its value. And according to Marx, that miscalculation is part of the fundamental reason why capitalism can't fully develop the productive forces, because it undervalues labor.
Right.
And the problem with providing a lot of free services which are paid for out of indirect taxation is that it means that every factory undervalues labor. And you tended to get more labor-intensive techniques used in Soviet factories than you got used in, say, German factories. So the idea that you can abolish the value form and abolish goes along with the idea things can be distributed free. Okay, it's okay distributing things for free if you levy a tax on all workers to deal with that. But if you say, oh, things are going to be free and they're going to be paid for out of the state budget, well, how is the state budget going to get its money? Well, the state budget gets its money by putting what amounts to a value-added tax on the outputs, a turnover tax on the outputs of all the state enterprises. So you end up actually using the type of taxation that Marx always argued against. Marx always argued against indirect taxation and for income taxes. And the Soviet Union actually followed the reverse policy. It followed a policy of relying almost entirely on indirect taxation, not having income taxes. And on Marxist basis, that gives you an irrational system of economic calculation.
Right. Hello, everyone. Today we're doing our next lecture in the series Free Universities for Free Scientific Education. Today we have Professor Paul Cockshott as our guest. For those of you who don't know who Professor Cockshott is, he's a Marxist professor active in economics and computer science at the University of Glasgow. He's the author